As Ansel Adams once said, you don't take a photograph, you make it. Over the course of this summer, I have been discussing how I am going to do a head-to-head between the Sony A7 III and the Canon R6. I want to switch to mirrorless, and there's a number of reasons that I want to switch to mirrorless. The first and most important reason is for you as my viewers. I want to be able to switch to mirrorless, as you've seen in my latest POV video, the ND video, which I will link right up there. I want to be able to show you guys exactly how I compose an image before I take it so that you can learn exactly what's going through my head as I take my photos. We tried that with Jessica in the last POV D5300 video I did, but with the mirror in the way of the DSLR camera, it was too laggy, it was too slow, and we weren't able to compose images as quickly as I'd like to. So I decided that the switch to mirrorless, which is the future anyways, was definitely going to be had for you, my viewers. The second reason I wanted to switch to mirrorless is because generally they are lighter than SLR cameras, they are smaller than SLR cameras, and as we get more and more into landscape photography and going out on adventures, it's nicer to not have to carry a bunch of heavy gear around. Now in front of me here are two cameras owned by Nick Del Duca. He is running the camera for us right now, special thanks to him. His channel is going to be down in the description below. Go check him out and make sure you subscribe. His cinematics are fantastic. But right in front of me here, I have a Sony A7 III and I have a Canon R6. They are currently both equipped with 85mm f1.4 lenses. And as you can tell, one of them sticks out a lot more than the other. We're going to talk about that. So the first 6 things that we are going to focus on are megapixels, weight, dimension, the number of native lenses, the back screen capabilities, and the cost. Now both of these cameras are pretty similar. This one is 24 megapixels, this one is 20 megapixels. The A7 III came out in 2018, whereas the R6 was released in 2020. Now you may have been laughing at my skit on how heavy that camera is, but this one here weighs in at 1.04 pounds. Just the body. This one weighs in at 1.5 pounds, almost 2 pounds with just the body. You throw that big lens on there, which we're going to be talking about in a little bit, it gets really heavy really quickly. In fact, this camera right here weighs more than my Nikon D70 from 2006 and my Nikon D5300, and it's almost the size of a DSLR camera. Let me grab one real quick and I'll show you. So as you can see, the R6 is a very similar size to the 5300 and even more similar to the Nikon D70, which again is a camera that's almost 20 years old. If we look at these bottom profiles here, you can see that the Canon R6 is a much larger camera. And that's not really what I'm looking for a mirrorless, so that's definitely a strike against the R6. Whereas the Sony is a much smaller profile than the D70, and it's a similar profile to the Nikon D5300, though the Nikon D5300 is a little bit less wide. This camera right here is less thick right here. So that's definitely something that's going to have to count against the Canon in that case, because I'm looking for a mirrorless camera for it to be lighter and for it to be smaller. Now the next thing I want to bring up is the actual width of the cameras. This one is 5 inches wide. This is 5.45 inches wide, so almost 6 inches. And this guy right here, the D5300, is only 4.9 inches wide. This is also a crop sensor camera. Now this one here is 24 megapixels, but again, it's crop sensor. Now the next thing that's really important is the number of native lenses. Now, the native lenses for the Sony, they're up in the thousands at this point in time, with as many third-party manufacturers as there currently are, because the E-mount lens setup has been around for quite some time. I stopped counting at about 45 lenses on Wikipedia. I looked it up and someone quoted in the thousands. This one has about 15 native lenses. There's not many lenses being made by the third party for the RF lenses, which is kind of strange because that lens mount has been around long enough where they should really be manufacturing. The Nikons, they have an infinite number because they've been producing those since the 50s. Now the cost. Now this is a slightly older camera, so we do expect it to be lower in cost. It is about $1,800 brand new, whereas the R6 is $2,499, but I'm going to market that more towards this being a much newer camera than this camera is right here. So now I've had some use with this, as you guys have seen before, and what I do like about this is that I can leave my finger on the shutter, I can turn it all on and off, and I can control almost the entire camera with one hand without ever removing it. This piece of grip right here that I grab onto where the battery lives is small enough for my hands. I do have relatively small hands, so it's easy for me to use my thumb without worrying about my hand cramping up while using this camera in order to make all the controls and do everything I need to do. What I have noticed about the Canon from the little bit of playing around with it that I have done is that this main control switch right over here. Now, with the Sony, all of the functions of this switch are right here, and I'll show that in just a moment. But this allows me to scroll, but to really get through my menus or anything, I have to use that. And that's difficult for me when I've got my finger on the shutter trying to get around and doing that. It actually causes my hand to start to cramp up right here. Again, I have pretty small hands. And it's very akin to the Nikon D70 in the size of that battery compartment and that grip. Though, the screen on the back of this, the LCD screen, is touchscreen. I think Canon meant for you to use that over using that knob on the back here. But if you're using gloves, if you're out in a colder shoot, or if you've got something on your hands, that could be problematic. Whereas with the Sony, with this A7 III, all of those controls that are controlled up here on the Canon are right here. I'm able to adjust my ISO, I'm able to go through my menus, my display, and everything from just that knob, and I can easily do that where my thumb naturally sits anyways. Now, the other thing about these two cameras is that back LCD screen. The Canon definitely comes out on top with that. This LCD screen here really does not have nearly as much movement as the Canon does. It kind of just pops out, it sits there, you can change your angles a little bit, which makes it nice when you're in a sunny spot and you've got a reflection on the back of it, and it's made it really nice for our POV videos because I'm able to make sure that you guys are able to see what I see as I'm taking photos. The Canon, on the other hand, definitely has the advantage here because the Canon's is not only a flip out, but it's also a swivel style, just like the Nikon D5300 and the Nikon D5100. Now the next thing I want to talk about, you might notice that this 85 sits out a lot more than this 85. And that's because the number of lenses, native lenses for the RF mount, are still pretty limited. I think this is a really important talking point when I'm comparing these two cameras. So we're actually going to discuss high-end glass, third-party glass, mid-grade glass, and cheap glass, or your lenses for these two cameras. And we're going to talk about the holy trinity of lenses for portrait photography. That's mostly what I do. Those are the lenses that are important to me. So we're going to be discussing 35mm, 50mm, and 85mm. The really high-end G Master lenses for the Sony E-mount in 35, 50, and 85mm. The 35mm f1.4 is $1,398 on average. The high-end 50mm f1.2 is $1,998, just shy of $2,000. And the 85mm f1.4 is $1,798, just shy of $1,800. Now with the Canon, your 35mm, they actually do not make an RF native lens at 35mm. The 50mm f1.2 that they make is $22.99. That is a price difference that's reasonable from going f1.4 down to f1.2. That's pretty normal from what you'd see. And their 85mm f1.2 is $27.99. $2,800, almost $1,000 more for that 85mm than you would for the Sony's native 85mm. Now for third-party lenses, we're going to look at Samyang. Samyang 85 1.4 is what's currently on this camera. That lens retails for about $579. The 50mm is $399, and the 35mm is $399, and those are all f1.4 lenses. For the Canon, the only third-party lens available currently is the Samyang f1.4, so it would look just like this, but it would be on this camera, and that is $698. That is really the only third-party lens available for the Canon R6, which is why we have to use this Canon adapter, which makes this Sigma 85mm f1.4 really stand out on this camera. Now the problem with that is these cameras were designed for their native glass so that it had a certain balance to it. So with the lens directly on the body, this camera is well balanced. It's easy to hold on to, it's easy to use, it's not front heavy. I can hold this up and shoot almost all day long without any issues. In fact, I did 3 shoots yesterday with this camera, and I was absolutely amazed that my arm wasn't sore afterwards. Now with the Canon, it doesn't have that ability for a third-party lens to sit flush against the body. So this feels really front heavy, and that front heavy creates strain right here on my wrist, especially because my hand is too small for this body as it is, and that makes it more difficult for me to use this in an all-day setting. Though they do have native lenses for it, they're just kind of expensive. Now I could get an 85mm Samyang for this. That's primarily what I've been using with the Sony, is the Samyang 85 1.4. So that's really not a deal breaker. I really wish that they get more third-party glass out there. The RF mount has been around for quite some time, but that's not necessarily a deal breaker because it means I could get some cheaper, older DSLR Canon lenses to use on this camera. I just got to worry about it being front heavy. Mid-grade lenses, 35mm f1.4 for the Sony brand mid-grade is about $1,000. The mid-grade 50mm f2.5 is $699. And their mid-grade is not an 85mm, it is a 90mm, and it is a macro lens at f2.8, and that one retails for about $1,100. The Sony RF has no mid-grade lenses available through Canon yet. So the last thing is really cheap lenses. Now we talk a lot about budget photography on this channel, and I think it's important that we take a look at this step as well. Now for the Sony, their Sony brand cheap glass for 35mm f1.8 is $748, and that's actually more of a mid-grade tier glass. It's a really good lens. They don't have one quite so cheap. Now their 50mm f1.8 is $199. That's pretty average for Nikkor, that's pretty average for Canon. That's a pretty average price point for a 50mm f1.8 Nifty 50. Their 85mm f1.8 is $279. So budget-wise, that isn't too big. That 35mm though really does jack up that average. Now for the Canon, their f1.8 35mm is $499, whereas their 50mm f1.8 is $200. Again, that is a really average price across the board. Their 85mm f2 is $599. So their prices are relatively similar. I think the 35mm for the Sony kind of jacks that price average up, but I still think it's cheaper with cheap glass to get the Sony A7 III than it would be the Canon R6. That's so clicky. Do you guys hear those clicks? That is so loud. That's almost as loud as the Nikon. What's the Sony sound like? I feel it focusing, but I don't hear it focusing. So the A6100 is my primary video camera, but I thought you all might be interested in the difference in video capabilities between these two cameras. Now this part of the video is not going to be taken into account when I finally make my decision to buy, because I'm not buying it to take video. I've got GoPros, the 6100, that's how I take my videos. But overall, the Sony has better raw video files between S-Log, SLG, and cinematic profiles, as well as as well as the ability to shoot in aperture priority and shutter speed priority, whereas with the Canon you can only shoot it in full auto mode or full manual mode, and that can make it a little more difficult. The other thing about it is the only lenses that are silently focused for the Canon are the native lenses. So those really expensive Canon-made RF lenses that we discussed before, whereas even with this Samyang, it's not nearly as noisy as the Canon is during that autofocus. Now, the big difference between the two is going to come from your video quality. The Sony A7 III shoots in 4K, 2400 frames per second, 30 frames per second, 8-bit, 4, 2, and 0. Whereas the Canon will shoot at 4K in 24, 30, and 60 frames per second, 8-bit at 4, 2, and 0, or 10-bit in log. So the video capabilities of the two cameras, this one has a better video quality than this one would overall, but this one has a better selection of silent focus lenses and more ability to control the video that you're taking, as well as post-processing it, because it has better raw capabilities than the Canon does. So the last thing I want to talk about is the photographic capabilities of both cameras. We talked about 24 megapixels versus 20 megapixels. In this day and age, you're not going to see a whole lot of a difference between 4 megapixels. Really where it comes down to is they both have an ISO range of 100 ISO to 200,000 ISO. They both clock out at a top speed of 1/8,000th of a second, and they both have eye tracking capabilities for both humans and animals. The big difference is with the Canon has auto tracking, so you can hit a point on your back focusing screen and it'll follow the point, not necessarily point focus. Whereas this one, when you hit that back screen, you get a point focus and that is it. With the Canon, one thing I forgot to bring up when we were talking about video is this one overheats after about 30 minutes of taking video, and it takes 20 to 30 minutes to cool down. There is a video where someone water cooled one, and it's built into the firmware that it just does that after 30 minutes. Whereas this one here does stop recording at 30 minutes, but you can immediately start recording again after that. My Nikon D5300 is the exact same. It has something to do with the tax status, video cameras versus cameras in the United States. So the lightness and size, it may seem like I've made my decision, and I haven't quite yet, because even though this one doesn't have as number of native lenses, you do have to use the adapter to use a lot of the lenses out there, the color profiles that I have heard coming from the Canons are absolutely stunning. And the photos work that I've seen done with them has been really amazing. I can't make my decision based on just holding the cameras and talking about the stats on these pages. I need to go out and I need to take photos with them. Nick Del Duca has been kind enough to let me borrow the A7 III to really get my hands-on experience with it. I still need to get some hands-on experience with this, so we're actually going to be doing another video in just a few weeks where we're going to go head-to-head, 35mm, 50mm, 85mm, same day, same shoot, same lighting conditions, and we're going to see if the color capture capabilities of this camera make the extra weight and the lack of native lenses worth buying, or if this camera is going to work exactly how I want it to work, or if the lightweight and the size of this will carry it to a point where making up for the color corrections in Lightroom will be worth it in order to have that lighter weight and that more ergonomic design. That's really where we're at right now. We're going to have to go out in the field. We're going to have to test both cameras head to head, the exact same lighting, the exact same model, and the exact same lenses. So don't forget to subscribe, you guys. That video will be up in just a few weeks. I release a video every single week. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, leave a comment, and share it. And I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. I will catch you all on the flip side. Bye.